Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ambassador Lighthizer, I'd like to start with you. I wanted to kind of just drill down on this question since you made it so central to your testimony about strategic decoupling. I wanted to just kind of make sure I'm understanding this correct. You're recommending some broad efforts, raising tariffs to level the balance across our entire bilateral trade. You're also talking about efforts that we can do in a range of different sectors, auto parts, pharmaceuticals, some of the national security that we talked about, but also agriculture, manufacturing. Am I understanding that correct? I just want to make sure I'm kind of capturing this correctly.
Yes.
So I guess I wanted to just kind of, because I really think that this gets to the heart of what this committee can try to do, and I think gets to the heart of what the chairman was saying in his opening. Dr. Schmidt, I've read some of your material and I was listening to your testimony. It sounds like you might have a different vision of this. Am I correct in kind of understanding this, that your thought about this kind of action that we should take, it's not necessarily that sort of broad across our entire economy, but instead something more targeted. Am I getting that correct here?
That is correct, and I want to defer to the other panel experts who understand their areas much better than I do. In the areas that I work in, it's crucial that we win in a bunch of global battles around platforms. That's innovation leadership. And the list, I'll just read the list: AI, chips, 5G, biotech, quantum, energy storage, and basically smart manufacturing, right? If we lose those things, then we lose the global platform. And if we lose the global platform, all of the economics don't work, because America is a huge exporter. We're a huge control point on all of these technologies. And I don't want to be dependent on Chinese for any of these.
Yeah, I agree with you on that front, and I think that's something hopefully all of us can agree upon. And there's this question that we've been tackling about, how do we make sure we're not going too small on this? How do we make sure that we're not in this issue of not doing enough? But Dr. Schmidt, I wanted to ask, again, from some of the things that I've read from you, it sounds like there's also a real risk of pushing this type of separation too fast and too far. Is that correct?
I am not in favor of the decoupling that's been sort of discussed colloquially, because I think all it would do is take non-strategic components and increase their prices to Americans, which would make things less competitive. I'm interested in making sure that we are the dominant player in the areas that I just named. I don't, at some level, worry too much about the others, because they're not going to determine the power outcome. They're important to other people, but in terms of America's dominance, the list that I gave you is the list. If, for example, we are the leaders in distributed computing, autonomy, and so forth, we'll have the best weapon systems.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that for all of us to kind of think through here is just trying to understand where that calibration is. And I think sometimes this is what frustrates me about this kind of concept of strategic decoupling, because it has a lot of vagueness to it. It seems to, in some ways, kind of stress this side of sense that we're not talking about full, but then I think this committee can really try to dive in to understand, well, then how do we narrow that and get a better sense of what that means? And Mr. Lighthizer, at the end of your testimony, you said this line here. It says that you said, quote, essentially the policies that what you recommend is, or quote, essentially the policies that China has towards the United States, I'm really just advocating for a policy of reciprocity. With all due respect, I did want to kind of push back on that and disagree here. I think we should be careful here to try to make sure that we're not necessarily talking about steps for the United States to take that would act and behave more like China. I do believe that it is action needed, but I want us to try to think through and ground it in what's made America successful, that we should really assess the cost of these different types of actions in different sectors and have an opportunity for us to weigh sort of the cost benefit for our country. That we think through these efforts in terms of not just the restrictions upon China, but also recognizing that a lot of what we need to do is about investing in ourselves. And Mr. Schmidt, I guess I just want to end with you here. We talk about this issue about positive investments, offensive type efforts that we can have in terms of our innovation in our economy, our workforce. We're also talking about restrictive type actions against China to try to hold them back from some of these gains. I know we're going to try to do both, but in your mind, as we're trying to, in this committee, triage this and prioritize, which one would you say is the one that is more fundamentally important and primary to our ability to compete?
Well, I always take the position that if you invest and you innovate ahead of everybody else, you're always winning. So I start from that as a premise. I do think that Chinese, as the other panelists have discussed, are critically dependent upon some things in the West, and making it harder for them to obtain them will make the vision that President Xi identified, Made in China 2025, that much harder. That's a strategic benefit to the United States. It's a very reasonable strategy. So far, the restrictions that have been put in place have been quite successful and well targeted. We should continue that as our policy.
Great. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Time expired. Mr. Hood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your valuable testimony here tonight. Ambassador Lighthizer, under your leadership at USTR, you put a priority on prioritizing U.S. economic security by challenging really unfair and discriminatory barriers in trade and help set protections for U.S. businesses, workers, and our economy. So far under the Biden administration, they've largely left in place the status quo of tariffs and other trade policies that were present at the end of the Trump administration. To some extent, this speaks to the bipartisan support you earned for many of your trade policies you helped develop when you were here. However, myself and many others are concerned that stagnant and cautious trade policies are inadequate currently to defensively counter China's economic manipulation on the global stage, or to offensively counter China by working proactively with partners and allies around the world to advance our interests. Can you comment or give us an opinion? Do you agree with the Biden administration's current stagnant approach to trade enforcement with China? And what would you recommend in terms of utilizing additional trade enforcement tools like the mechanism used in Phase 1?
Well, thank you, Congressman. First of all, I appreciate the comment. And with respect to the tariffs that we put in place, I think it's a compliment to the Biden administration that they have kept them in place. And like every administration, there are good people who understand this issue, and there are some who don't understand it, and they have the same mix that all the other administrations do. So there's kind of like two questions. One, I think, what else would I do? And then two, how would I work with allies, all right? So let me say, first of all, as I've said in my written testimony, I believe that China is not in compliance with the agreement that they entered into, and if I were in government, I would use the authority under U.S. law to raise tariffs on them and to further this process of decoupling, which I believe we started. And really started under the 301 in a bipartisan way, right? It really was. I mean, when I would testify, I would quote the former speaker and others who were in agreement with that position. So if I were in the government, I would now raise those tariffs. I'd have tariffs across the board. I would take the next step in decoupling. That's what I would do. At least, I should say that's what I would recommend. Obviously, the president would make the decision. In terms of working with allies, clearly, we need to have a positive agenda. I am not one, however, that believes we need additional FTAs or that we should be doing anything to help our allies like us more by giving more U.S. jobs away, right? So, I mean, and at some point we ought to have that discussion. That is, in fact, my view. I think there is a positive agenda you can have. There's a lot of things that you can talk about in the technology area that we ought to be doing. Some of them, by the way, this administration is talking about. I mean, personally, for example, I would want to see people come together and have some kind of a carbon border adjustment, right? Not a carbon tax, I'm not for that, but a carbon border adjustment. There's things in trade law enforcement, there's things in customs facilitation, there's a lot of things you can do with allies to kind of create kind of a brand that I think is helpful.
And Ambassador Lighthizer, is it your current position, I read your testimony, that there should be no outbound investment at all to China? So,
in the first place, I would defer to Roger on these things and to Dr. Schmidt on the technology stuff, because those are their areas and they're better by far than I am in understanding them. In my judgment, with all due respect, I think reciprocity is a good policy, by the way, across the board with everyone all the time. But in my judgment, there is no justification. But if someone could have one, I would say put severe restrictions on. That's why I was kind of vague about that. I think that the direction should be to limit it substantially. And the wisdom of this committee is as good as any other wisdom to decide where exactly those lines should be drawn. I'm not going to say I know the answer to everything, but in my opinion, we should not be, if you cross the line and say they are a hostile adversary and they're trying to bring us down, once you cross that line, then it all looks different. And this is one thing that looks different. It's not about whether some guy in New York can buy a big boat with the money that he made on some deal, right? It's about whether or not we're going to have our kids have this kind of a country and our grandkids have it. That's what it's about. And those are not kind of the same kind of thing. So for me, I would say, sorry to the guy in New York. You just have to deal with the boat you have. And I'm going to worry more about the woman with the hard hat going to work.
Thank you.
Michelle.
Thank you. The long-term anti-competitive actions of China, including forced IP transfers, dumping, illegal subsidies, corporate espionage, and currency manipulation, as well as the truly abhorrent actions of the Chinese Communist Party that they have taken in their genocide against the Uyghur people, combined with the really capricious zero-COVID policies instituted by Xi and his stated goal of near total self-sufficiency in the manufacturing and production of goods and services and the Made in China 2025 policies, it's really made the work of this committee to ensure the American economic competitiveness in the global economy incredibly timely. So our country is already seeing record gains as we've moved to invest in high-end chips manufacturing, capabilities through the CHIPS and Science Act, as well as cutting-edge electric vehicle and battery production through the Inflation Reduction Act. And as a result of this legislation, businesses have announced private investments of $210 billion in semiconductor manufacturing and $88 billion in electric vehicle and battery production over just the past 2.5 years. So, Ambassador Lighthizer, we're really seeing a renaissance of American manufacturing, but combating China's economic coercion and winning the global competition and being at the forefront of the technological frontier will really require a unified economic and diplomatic strategy across the entire federal government in close coordination with our allies in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. And we've already seen China take the lead in expanding its economic influence worldwide through the Belt and Road Initiative, and in the Pacific region through its ratification of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So, as sort of a strong example of the critical need for multilateral economic engagement with our allies to counter China, the Biden administration earlier this year negotiated a deal with Japan and the Netherlands to join our export controls against China's semiconductor industry. This effort has been critical in degrading China's advanced semiconductor manufacturing and R&D sectors by depriving them of the modern tech and inputs needed to grow and expand. However, without the joint effort of our allies, our unilateral export controls could really be evaded and sometimes rendered toothless. So I think we've heard here today, and I think we've seen this from the administration as well in the previous administration, this desire to reshore a lot of American manufacturing and support American business. But we also do need our allies in this fight to, I think, present the strongest possible counter to Chinese incursions across the world. How do you balance that? You were talking a little bit about it, and it almost sounded as if you said, we've got to do what we've got to do, and then we've got to brand what we're doing to bring our allies along with us. And I think that's probably what Jake Sherman has said a little bit of, but is there more we could do with our allies, not free trade agreements, but some steps that we could take to sort of help bring them along with us?
So that's a great question and a fundamental question, and thank you. First of all, let me just say that when you talk about this manufacturing coming back and these things being done, all of which of course are true, keep in mind that a lot of this started because of the tariffs we put in place. So we put 25% tariffs on all this stuff. I'm sure Dr. Schmidt knows far more about the effects than I do, but the effects were on initially all the technology, and then it sort of bred beyond that. So in addition to the industrial policy that you're espousing, these tariffs, and I would suggest higher tariffs across the board, are also a contributor. So if you look at why does Apple go to India for their phones, there's a whole sense that this is an unstable relationship between the United States and China, and the tariffs are one of the classic ones. Now the next thing I just want to make that point. I'm sorry for hijacking your minute, but I'll talk quickly. So do I think we should work with allies? Yeah, for sure. Do I think we should give up access to the U.S. market in order to get them to do it? No. Do I think we should not act unilaterally because the allies won't agree? No. I think you act unilaterally and then you try to bring them along if you can. This is too important. And I'm also very clear-eyed about the allies, and we can talk maybe in the next round about various groups of them. The Europeans don't see themselves as marching behind the American flag against China. They see themselves as a third pole. And they're trying to game both of us. Now, are they on our side fundamentally in the sense that that we're democracies and the like? Yeah, but I think sometimes we get the idea that they're more on board with us. And recently, you've seen President Macron's comments and the Germans' comments, so you get a sort of a sense that they don't necessarily see themselves as following our lead. But I'm sorry.
Gentleman's time has expired. Dr. Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me add my thanks to the prior members of the committees for this panel, these witnesses. I can't remember when we've had a more interesting discussion in Washington, and as my colleague, Mr. Newhouse, suggested, it's a little disturbing as well. Ambassador Lighthizer, your opening statement provided some key insights and recommendations that will come before this committee. I strongly agree with your sense for a need for trade regime that helps our country, our workers, and strives for technological independence and regulates both incoming and outgoing investments for us to our benefit. This is essential to national security and economic prosperity. And as our trade deficit continues to grow, global threats continue to emerge, we must not continue transferring wealth to an adversary. I thought you did a great job outlining that in your testimony. I enjoyed your points on the congressional reform of the de minimis tariff thresholds, making it harder for CCP to elude our customs. De minimis being the threshold where our duties go into effect, and it's currently $800 per person per day in the United States. And that incentivizes gaming our laws. Foreign exporters, as you mentioned, can access our markets for free. When the importation is less than $800, or they transship it to a country that enjoys that. Right now, China is doing a shell game with their exports to the United States by laundering them through Mexico and Canada, thereby dodging essentially all duties. Specifically, you cited the Mexican company Baja Fulfillment as a particularly example of bad actors, but I think it's just one example as well. This has to stop. So, Your Excellency, what can Congress do to end China's shell games in trade?
Wow. And I have 2 minutes and 57 seconds. So, for me, this is why I, after thinking about this forever, said you just have to put tariffs on and have strategic decoupling. You figure out the technology. I'll go along with you on whatever you come up with. But you can't keep transferring hundreds and hundreds of billions, maybe $500 billion, and in stolen technology, maybe it comes to $800 billion a year. I mean, their economy is only 17 trillion, right? I mean, in other words, you're every year you're giving them. I think it's fair to say that this, as I said, this economic miracle really is just our economic stupidity and not crossing that line and realizing what's at stake. I mean, this is really, really serious stuff. Eventually, we're going to have strategic decoupling, right? I mean, it's just no question. The only question is whether you're going to do it before or after it's too late. That's the only issue. So you said, what would I do? I would put tariffs on. So one way to think about this, and I have it in the written testimony, I didn't say it here, one way to think about this is, why do they have these large surpluses every year? Why does that happen? Now, some of it is stuff we can identify. Oh, you cheated on this, you cheated on that, you dumped, you sell, whatever the things are. But a lot of it is just systemic. It is the deficits in and of themselves, when they're massive and continual, are themselves protectionist. They're absolute proof that they're not playing by the rules. So they discourage consumption in their own country. They put all the money into exports. What that does is it forces the rest of the world, including us, to go into debt. So how do you counter that? You have two ways. You either continue to go into debt or you put tariffs on. I mean, there's just literally, you could, besides tariffs, you could put, some other kind of barrier. But you either have a barrier, I would say tariffs, or you go into debt. And it's happening across the world. I mean, somehow you have to change that. In my opinion, at some point you're going to come to the view is we can't continue to go into debt to China.
So I don't know who's more upset, you or us.
Least of all for televisions and T-shirts and all this stuff, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Eventually, you're all going to say we have to change.
So I think what I'm going to do, I have 26 seconds left, so I think what I'm going to do instead is commit you to swear that you'll help us in the future. We're going to put you on speed dial and follow a lot of these ideas and also your other panelists, because I've heard some great ideas here tonight and some great insights. So I want to thank you all very much for taking the time to spend some time with us this evening.
Well, I appreciate it, and I am, and I'm sure the other do, because I know Roger and I've met Dr. Schmidt are available. I mean, if you ought to just call, and if you have a senior staff person that wants to call. I mean, this is really important to all of us. This is what we do.
You could text, you could email, they're findable, trust me.
We will now provide the witnesses' cell phone numbers on national TV. Yeah. Please state for the record. Yeah. All right, the gentleman's time expired. Ms. Stevens.